Hello Funkers, Tony Funk here, and in today's Unscripted Tangents, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about textual criticism and the interpretation of symbolism. Basically, the purpose of this tangent is to address a kind of comments that I've gotten over the years. I get it a lot. Most recently, this comment right here, it's 3 days old, and I thought about maybe addressing this and making a video about it. So let's read what it says. This guy here says, 100% the writers never intended any of the shit you're saying in this video. You're just making stuff up. Couple grammatical errors there. We'll ignore them, but he's right. He's 100% right. This comment obviously was in response to my In Defense of Rei Ayanami video, where I basically say that Rei has a lot more depth than, a lot of people give her credit, including Hideaki Anno, and, all of this was due, of course, to the history of her creation, etc., etc., etc. A lot of unintended consequences led to her being, in my opinion, a really interesting character. Now, what I want to argue is that, fiction, in this particular case, we're going to be talking about anime, of course, is a lot more important than most people probably even realize. The reason that I'm saying this is because anime, just like fiction books, is usually the brainchild of a single individual. This is in contrast to comics, which have committees and large companies kind of lording over the creation, and this is also in contrast to like TV series where, of course, there is a creator who's got a vision, but they also have a team of writers behind them, they have producers, and they have the network that kind of dictates what direction things should go. As we all know, manga writers also have editors, they also have people who are kind of telling them in what direction their story should go, but as a rule of thumb, they have a lot more creative control than a lot of other mediums of fiction. Now, the reason that this is important is because we get a glimpse into a single individual's psyche when we look at anime. Now, why is it important to interpret anime? Why is it important to find symbolism? Well, before I kind of tell you guys this, I'm going to tell you guys a story that maybe some of you have already heard of before, and it's about this guy named Bruce McAllister. So Bruce McAllister, at the time, he was 16 years old, and he was taking a literature class. And after going through the motions of the class, doing assignments where he had to interpret symbolism and scrounge around and find the hidden symbolism behind a lot of works, he was kind of nettled, you could say. And he told his teacher, I bet that most of the symbolism that we're gleaming from these works isn't even intended. And so, as a way to prove this, he sent out 150 letters to 150 different living authors at the time. This was 1963, so there were a lot of prominent English-speaking authors, and he actually got somewhere around 75 responses. But what's really interesting is that these responses from the authors regarding symbolism were eclectic. So here we have two questions. One of them says, do you feel you subconsciously place symbolism in your writing? And then the other one is, do readers ever infer that there is symbolism in your writing where you had not intended it to be? If so, what is your reaction and feeling to this type of inference? Annoyance? That it is humorous? Indifference? Here I couldn't tell you whose responses these are, this is just some author, but in response to the question regarding subconsciously placing symbolism in his or her writing, this author said no. But here one of Ralph Ellison's most interesting answers to the questions is the following. Number 3 says, yes, readers often infer that there is symbolism in my work which I do not intend. My reaction is sometimes annoyance. It is sometimes humorous. It is sometimes even pleasant, indicating that the reader's mind has collaborated in a creative way with what I have written. I think the key word here is collaborated. Now, why is this a key word? Well, when we really think about fiction, when we think about reading a fiction book, when we think about watching an anime, we're not passively just watching information or reading information. We're interpreting it as we're watching. We're reacting to it with emotions, with thoughts, theories, etc. It's very much a collaborative effort. And when mangaka and writers are expressing themselves, they are also expressing themselves subconsciously. What I mean by this is that there's something beyond the symbolism that an author created. The story itself kind of subconsciously tells you something about the author's values. Now, what I'm going to give you guys here is a few examples of inferences that you can make. These inferences do not mean they're true, they do not mean they're false, and they do not mean they're academically sensible. They're just inferences that typical human beings can make in their everyday lives that we can also make in relation to authors' works. In this particular case, anime. Let's think about some inferences we can make about Dragon Ball. So what's one thing that we know about Akira Toriyama? Well, when he was alive, he was a very introverted and insular person. Now, having said that, Dragon Ball revolves around a character who's socially inept. Goku at the beginning of the series has no idea what a woman is, he's an idiot, he doesn't know how to communicate, and yet he turns enemies into friends and they become lifelong pals of his. One of the inferences that we can make of this series is that perhaps Akira Toriyama subconsciously was living vicariously through his character, and maybe this was his escape. Maybe this was one way in which Akira Toriyama could live in the shoes of someone who was gregarious and naturally gifted at going out into the world, and making friends along the way. This does not necessarily mean that Akira Toriyama has always wanted to be extroverted, but what it could mean is that maybe Akira Toriyama wanted to consider that lifestyle. So even though there is a lot of intentional symbolism in Dragon Ball, we're talking religious, Taoist, and martial arts elements, maybe there were some unintended morsels of information regarding Akira Toriyama in his works that he didn't consciously put in there. But now that example just told us something about an individual. Is it possible that anime could tell us some broader ideas, maybe perhaps about Japanese culture? Let's consider Attack on Titan and what it could say about the Japanese education system. Attack on Titan is a series about giant monsters called Titans and the politics behind military operations, as well as many other smaller themes. But one of the interesting things is that Attack on Titan has long since been associated with fascism. Now, whether or not you agree with this is kind of irrelevant. Let's just talk about a couple things here. The series incorporates a lot of historical parallels, which you'd be hard-pressed to say weren't intentional. Off the top of my head, I can think of a lot of parallels between the Jewish ghettos of World War II and the treatment and attempted genocide on the Eldians. Now, one of the precursors to World War II was the First Sino-Japanese War. It was a war of imperialism in which the Japanese wanted to take over parts of Manchuria and possibly all of East Asia. What's interesting is that series creator Hajime Isayama actually admitted that Don Pixis was based on a real Japanese general during that time, named Akiyama Yoshifuru. What's interesting to note is that most of his campaigns were in Manchuria and later in Korea. He was also famous in participating in the Port Arthur massacre of the First Sino-Japanese War, a massacre which, by the way, was pretty bloody and included a lot of horrific acts. But we really can't infer that Hajime felt one way or another. It's possible to create a character who's inspired by Mussolini and not support Mussolini or fascism. So in order to get a better picture, we have to look at Isayama's personal life. Now, what's interesting is that Isayama has long since been implicated in a series of tweets that were anti-Korean, suggesting that the Japanese educated the Koreans, in addition to downplaying the atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese military during their occupation of the peninsula. So now, with that broader context, what broader picture does this paint behind the themes and historical parallels in Attack on Titan? Well, for starters, we can assume that Isayama was familiar with World War II to the point where he could draw parallels to the precursors of the war, as well as have a somewhat competent insight on what fascism is. When we assume that his tweets regarding Korea are real, however, we start to paint a picture behind the education that Isayama could or could have not had. What this implies is that it's entirely possible Isayama had an education that covered some aspects of World War II, but perhaps glossed over a lot of the atrocities committed against the Korean people, the destruction of their culture, and maybe to a larger extent, the atrocities committed against China. But insights about the education of a country are just the tip of the iceberg. Other series creators, such as Hideaki Anno, created their respective series as forms of transparent self-reflection. As we all know, Evangelion's heavy use of psychology and psychoanalytics resulted from Anno's own desires to contextualize his own depression. And although Evangelion heavily inserted intentional symbolism, a lot of it was also unintentional. When we combine Hideaki Anno's own comments in the past, such as this one, and I quote, "Japan lost the war to the Americans. Since that time, the education we received is not one that creates adults. Even for us, people in their 40s, and for the generation older than me, in their 50s and 60s, there's no reasonable model of what an adult should be like." So if we can take this information regarding Hideaki Anno's own feelings of post-World War II Japan and layer them over the depictions of the characters he created within Evangelion, we can create a more complete picture of his feelings about escapism. Though Anno's feelings regarding otaku culture are well known, that being that he has a fraught relationship with it, we can assume that maybe on a subconscious level, Hideaki Anno is strongly criticizing Gendo and Zella for trying to enact the Human Instrumentality Project and creating a world of complete escapism. So to reiterate, why is looking for symbolism in anime important? Well, it's because it can give us varying degrees of insight that would otherwise be very difficult to extract. On a personal level, we were able to make inferences about Akira Toriyama's personal life and how Dragon Ball might be a form of escapism. On a geopolitical level, we can infer how Japan might be forming their students and might be misrepresenting attitudes about their imperial history, and on a sociological level, we can understand the attitudes of a baby boomer's perspective on a Japanese people that was forced to escape the pities of their own economic struggles. And though all of these things are inferences, the broader importance of textual criticism is to practice critical thinking and to help us read between the lines in our everyday lives. And sure, one could ask the authors or mangaka themselves regarding the symbolism that they created. But even if you could, I can guarantee you that they wouldn't tell you nearly as much as their works would. So there you go, Funkers. Next time you see something and you think, I don't know if that was intended or not, just remember, it doesn't have to be.